I grew up with a lot of history, with a lot of American history, but not necessarily military history. The sort of generations of my family were such that we were less touched by World War I and World War II than a lot of other Americans were. My original interest was much more global. I was interested in international relations and in international development, and then I got fascinated by 20th century Europe, and of course there the First World Wars the two World Wars are central. It was really only later that I realized that the history I wanted to study was of the United States and of our own country. In some ways, my interest in the United States in the First World War has always been as a way to get at the United States. That this is a sort of crucial turning point, a kind of moment that where a crisis sort of concentrates the American mind, that makes people ask who they are as a people, what they imagine, and so in that sense, I came to this as a project in American politics, more than one on war or foreign relations. Woodrow Wilson was never a pacifist, for sure, and in fact was quite dismissive of actual pacifists, which included his own son-in-law. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, but Wilson had a vision for the United States and the world that was distinct from the European empires that clashed in 1914. And so when he wanted to keep this famous line, which is in fact not Wilson's, but his campaign manager, he kept us out of war. That line is not because Wilson opposed all wars, but because he thought this war was not in America's. Early 20th century is a moment when modern war and modern international law are developing at the same time. And so there was certainly a sense of the laws of war, the norms of behavior for combatants. And Wilson, like many, felt that the Germans had violated those through submarine warfare, through the invasion of Belgium, and that responding to German actions was crucial. Whether that could be done short of war is what Wilson hoped. Before 1917, by the spring of 17, he felt he had no other option. He famously asked for Americans to be neutral in thought and in deed, which meant that he really wanted Americans to stay out of it. This is a concern that he has, that he wants to make sure that Americans, either as individuals or through institutions, didn't drag the United States into the war through the back door. That there were plenty of Americans, whether they supported one of the warring powers for ethnic reasons, whether they were passionate about the Allied cause, who wanted to go to Europe, wanted to fight, wanted to get more involved. Theodore Roosevelt, the former president and Woodrow Wilson's arch enemy, of course, is sort of one of those people. And Wilson is worried that and that actions that individuals are taking might bring the U.S. into the war.
What about the economics of it all? When our machine, the United States, much of it was dependent on international trade, and how did he balance the act from the corporate America, thinking Germany or thinking the other or England and others?
Well, that's one of the great ironies, right? Because while Wilson is telling Americans, don't do anything that will slowly drag us into the war, he is encouraging Americans with the out of the other side of his mouth to do things that did, in fact, actually slowly drag us into war. So the United States was, from an early point, one of the only major providers of industrial goods to the warring powers, and particularly to the Allies. And because of the British blockade of Germany, almost all of American production is going to the Allies, even though we are notionally neutral. And it's the same with banking, that the major American banks are loaning enormous amounts of money to the British and to the French. You I think we can say, for sure, that if Britain and France had collapsed in 1917 or 18, they would have taken the American economy down with it. At the time, and in retrospect, people were critical of Wilson for allowing this to happen on his watch, and in fact actually to tacitly encourage it. I don't think Wilson wanted American financial institutions or industries to profit from the war. And in fact, the question of war profits becomes a controversy during the war itself. But he also didn't want to tie the hands of the American economy simply because Europe was at war. Right? That saying, there could be no trade with Europe, saying there could be no financial interactions with Europe, would also have harmed the American economy. He's really sort of caught in a bind.
1916, an election year, and that clearly was a hot issue. Was the Democratic Party completely in sync with Wilson, or was there divisions within the party?
We forget in 2018 that 100 years ago parties contained multitudes, that they could include under the same tent people who had very different visions of foreign policy, different visions of the size of the federal government and its authority. And that's certainly the case. In 1916, the United States is not yet in the war, but the war is starting to shape our decisions, and particularly our decisions about how big of an army to have. The Democrats are bitterly divided over this issue between those who think that a war, if it comes, needs to be fought by a more prepared America, and those who feel that if you build an army, you will use it. And the best way to prevent a war is not to build up for one. So this becomes a big issue in the election, and it certainly becomes an issue in Congress. They debate something called the National Defense Act of 1916, which is one of the most important laws that Americans have never heard of, and that really sort of gives us the large modern army that we have in the 20th century and beyond. But it's a contentious question, and the 1916 election is the closest election of the 20th century until 2000.
Well, about that act that nobody knows about, you want to elaborate a little bit for the camera?
Sure. So the National Defense Act of 1916 does a few main things, right? First of all, it substantially increases the size of the standing army and had been in under 100,000 before that, raises it to initially to about 150,000, and of course makes it possible for it to rapidly expand to almost 4 million by the end of the war. Along with it, there's other legislation increasing naval construction, so there are a lot more ships. And then the third thing that it does is it gives the president the authority to call out the National Guard, to federalize the militia. So in some ways, the American militia tradition of locally raised troops controlled by who elect their own officers and all the rest doesn't completely disappear, but it really does come to essentially to an end in 1916, and the National Guard becomes another part of the army.
1916 election, Wilson's opponent, the Republican opponent, was who?
So in 1916, the Republicans are also in a bind because they want to run against Wilson. Wilson is the anti-war candidate, but they don't really want to be the pro-war candidates. They know that Americans are not looking for that. They end up with a sort of compromise candidate, Charles Evans Hughes, who from the U.S. Supreme Court sort of runs for president. And Hughes has a difficult time distinguishing himself from Wilson. He and Wilson in many ways are saying the same things, although most Americans understand that a vote for Hughes would probably bring the United States into war sooner. But they also still are voting on their economic concerns, on jobs, on the economy. Wilson had spent his first term, particularly before the war begins, as a domestic reformer. So he draws a lot of the vote for progressive reform causes. And the other thing that really pushes the election is that by 1916, women in several states are already authorized to vote, and particularly in swing states. California at that time was a swing state, and women were voting in California, and all evidence suggests that they voted a little bit more for Wilson, and that put him over the top.
So 1916, Wilson's elected. 1917, the winds of war changed somewhat. Part of that, I guess, is the sinking of the Lusitania. Is that overplayed, that particular one event? Were we kind of moving our way in that direction anyways?
I think if there's one thing I would like Americans to unlearn that is not true, is a popular understanding that the United States entered the First World War because of and immediately after the sinking of the Lusitania. In fact, that's just not true. The Lusitania was sunk in 1915. It was a diplomatic and a political crisis. There were calls for war. It certainly turned many people's emotions against Germany, but it also generated another series of other things, generated a promise from Germany not to sink civilian ships. And this was basically a deal between the United States and Germany that kept America out of the war, the so-called Sussex Pledge. Now, two things happened, right? One is in the 100 years since the Lusitania, we had Pearl Harbor and we had 9/11. And I do think that when people say we entered the war after the sinking of the Lusitania, it's because they're looking for that one triggering event. And there was not that one triggering event for World War I. That said, in the very early 1917, the German government is sort of looking at the state of the war. They're looking at the maps of Europe. They think that the only way that they can survive is if they launch a new offensive, break the British blockade, and push through to Paris. They know that this will require them to resume submarine warfare, to break the Sussex Pledge. They are pretty sure this will bring the United States into the war. But they are also pretty sure that America and its 150,000 soldiers and its population that's deeply divided about whether to declare war, let alone to send troops, will probably not send any troops to Europe in time to make a difference. Mm-hmm. So the Germans gamble in early 1917, and I'm not sure that it was a bad bet, all things considered. They turned out to be wrong about both the American people and their will for war, and the American Army's ability to mobilize and transport men quickly.
So Lafayette, we are here. That's the phraseology you use. My grandfather got caught up in that. From a recruiting perspective, and I know the front cover of your book has emotional aspect of getting the Americans' youth fired up to go over to Europe, which they had really no prior experience.
Right. So as soon as the war is declared, the next question is, well, who's actually going to fight it, and how many, and how soon? And there's a sort of division between those who want to raise the army entirely by volunteers and tap into American traditions of volunteerism, and those who think that the war should be sort of mobilized through conscription, through the draft. And the argument for the draft, in fact, actually was not to necessarily to bring more men in, but in fact actually to keep some of them out, to give the government the authority to manage who stays in and who stays out, particularly to make sure that farmers and factory workers and people with children are not conscripted into the war. And so the draft, eventually registration for the draft covers all men from 18 to 45. Because of the war ends faster than anyone expected, very few older men or men with families were actually drafted. It's a young men's war for the most part. But this conscription is necessary for sort of efficiency and government organization, but the draft was also necessary to fill the ranks. That recruiting from volunteers alone would not have generated enough support for the army that Wilson and Pershing felt that we needed.
For the camera, that old John Montgomery flag, Uncle Sam, which is the front cover. What's the backstory behind that?
So perhaps the most famous image in American politics is this poster of Uncle Sam saying, "I want you," for the U.S. Army. Mm-hmm. It's actually based on a magazine cover that was done in 1916, before the war began, or before the U.S. was in it, by the artist James Montgomery Flagg. And this appeared on the cover of a magazine called Leslie's Illustrated Weekly Newspaper, and was, as far as we know, didn't get a lot of attention as a work of art in 1916, but in early 1917 it was sort of brought back as a U.S. Army recruiting poster at a time when the Army was still taking individual volunteer recruits before April 1917. And by the end of the war, some 4 million copies of this poster were published and printed all over the country. And Flagg did dozens of posters for the war effort, but this poster in particular remained as the iconic image of the war. I mean, one thing we certainly do know is that Woodrow Wilson did not try to command soldiers on the battlefield. Mm-hmm. That he took a remarkably hands-off position on the war. Far more hands-off than Roosevelt in World War II, than Truman in Korea, certainly than Johnson in Vietnam, or Bush in Iraq and Afghanistan. And famously, I can't remember the quote word for word, but basically, Wilson met with Pershing one time before Pershing left for France, and said, "Do a good job." Right, something like that. Basically, gave him one general sentence of guideline. Pershing was insistent, along with many others, that Americans would fight separately. He had watched the European armies basically throw men at each other and at machine guns for 3 years and get no results. And the Allied commanders wanted Pershing to basically feed his own troops directly into their forces, knowing that the Americans would be younger, better fed, better equipped, and so forth. Pershing refused to do this. That said, he ends up actually adopting many of the tactics that he had sort of criticized his predecessors for using. Basically just throwing enormous numbers of American soldiers against the Germans. But by 1917, 1918, as the German army is collapsing, that's more likely to yield victory than it had 4 years earlier.
So 1917, 1918, armistice, November 11th, 1918, 11 a.m. At some point, Wilson gets a sense that the war is ours, and it's just a function of how it's going to end, unconditional surrender, all of those processes. When did that, is there a moment in your study where he says, "I think we got this one"?
I think Woodrow Wilson knew, even before the United States entered the war, that the Allies would win. And he actually gives this sort of famous speech calling for a peace without victory. That he wanted and called for a peace that would not be full of vengeance and retribution and reparations payments and aimed at the destruction of Germany. There were plenty of military officers, and Pershing was among them, who wanted to march all the way on to Berlin. There were even some who advocated extending U.S. military action into revolutionary Russia to crush the Bolsheviks, and in fact the U.S. did send a small force to intervene in the Russian Civil War. So in that sense, the peace without victory was not a unanimous commitment. And then, of course, in the Paris Peace Conference, much of that vision of a peace without victory was unraveled by the insistence from Britain and France in particular on a harsher peace against Germany.
The 14 points that so famously discussed, was there a brain trust of folks within the Wilson administration who sort of helped fashion that concept?
Yeah, so Wilson had a team of advisors, in particular a group called the Inquiry, which was designed to inform and advise him on foreign relations. And he had area experts, people who knew or at least claimed to know a lot about the regions involved, whether it was the Ottoman Empire, about the various countries of Europe, about the imperial system, about economies. And all of them are sort of, filling his desk with memos and reports. And Wilson, still in his sort of professor mode, actually read them and learned a great deal from them, which is remarkable, considering when he was in Paris how busy he was and how sick he was. He was not in good health. And he really, sort of educating himself about the world from these advisors, both before he, while the war is happening and after the war is over as well. When Wilson arrives in France for the Paris Peace Conference, he knows that the conference is his to run, and the leaders of the European countries also know that it is his to run, and they resent that. They feel that they were the ones who had been there from the beginning, who had fought Germany from the beginning. They were the ones who were going to have to live in post-war Europe. And they also, sort of resented Wilson's style, his sort of, his imperious and somewhat arrogant style. Famously, Georges Clemenceau of France, when he heard about the 14 points, said, the good Lord had only 10, that certainly makes us, see that there are tensions within these countries as they're figuring out what the peace will look like.
Clemenceau, Lloyd George, Orlando, and Wilson, the kind of that big four. You see this famous picture of the four of them, and variously. Did they really get along? I know it's a loaded question,
right.
But yeah.
No, I mean the big four didn't get along. They also they are politicians. They're not there to get along. They're there to negotiate. They are surrounded by enormous coteries of diplomats and advisors. And I think the other part that's interesting about the Paris Peace Conference is all the countries that are there. This is really, in some ways, one of the first big global conventions of nations. And all the other people who are there who are not invited. Famously, the Vietnamese anti-colonial activist who would later go by the name of Ho Chi Minh was there hoping to have his country's sort of wishes heard by the convention. Several African American and African leaders arrive. Some of the African American leaders who arrived, who hoped to be heard by the convention, in fact, were denied passports and and William Monroe Trotter, who is a Boston-based journalist, actually stowed away on a ship and made his way to Paris to cover it. So everyone, not just leaders, but of nations, but all leaders of people, understand that the decisions being made in Paris will have an enormous impact, not just on post-war Europe, but on the world more generally.
Are you of the opinion that which ended up as the Versailles Treaty and the harsh reparations against Germany was really not only a precipitating factor, but perhaps World War I continued just during that time period really into what resulted in World War II?
No, I actually reject that theory for two reasons. So there is a commonplace that describes the period from 1914 to 1945 as one long European civil war, and that the incomplete peace of 1919 somehow led inexorably to war in 2 decades later. But I don't think that's true, in part because the Second World War is a global war that begins in Asia in the 1930s. And this is, so calling it a European Civil War is a very Eurocentric way of thinking about it. It ignores Japan and China and the conflicts there. And the other is that I think it relieves the people of the 1930s from the responsibility that they had to prevent the war. All wars are wars of choice, and all wars are preventable. No war is inevitable, and although the peace treaty of 1919 was an obstacle to a long-term peace in Europe, it was not an insurmountable one. You know, one thing that I think we should understand is that the period in the 1920s and 30s, for most of the people who lived through it, was not an interwar period, but a post-war period. That they felt that they were coming to terms with a post-war world. Making sure that the wounds of war were healed, making sure that societies were reconstructed, trying to rebuild society, but also remake norms. So of course the 1920s is full of technological changes, consumer culture, changes in gender roles, all of that. But that said, it was also a society that felt like it still had to work out what that war had been about. And that leads to a lot of conflict over what it meant, about how Europe should be organized, how America and society should work, all of that. Much of the effort in 1945 and 46 to remake Germany and also Japan is informed by what Americans think they had failed to do in 1918. There had been a debate actually about whether to try the Kaiser, and this is ultimately abandoned. But you know, the real question in part was sort of what kind of international institutions will create a durable peace. The League of Nations, was seen as a failure for institutional reasons, as well as for the fact that the United States was not a member. So the United Nations that's produced after the war actually generates, sort of a different institution, and it is something that Americans are at the heart of from the beginning. There's really no question from the get-go of whether the United States will be in the United Nations. And in fact, it's an American project from the get-go. And similarly, the post-war war crimes trials are designed, I think, to respond to the fact that there hadn't really been any after the First World War to any extent, and to try to use law as an institution to create some sense of justice and closure. And I think that in some ways the the institutions that become the IMF and the World Bank, the sort of, the post-war sort of Bank for European Reconstruction and Development. These financial institutions are also designed to stabilize post-war Europe in ways that that post-war Europe had been so unstable in the 1920s.
You also do constitutional law. What's Jackson mean to you?
Justice Jackson appears only, only here and there in the class that I teach, but my undergraduates always find him appealing, in part because I think they find him they find him honest and common sense-like in his approach. They are surprised in our current highly politicized court environment to imagine a justice stepping away from the bench for an extended period of time, as Jackson did when he went to Nuremberg. That's sort of hard for them to imagine, but they also sort of understand that what that action did for both the United States' role in the world and also for justice in the broadest sense, right? That he was serving his country and serving the Constitution best by being off the court rather than on it. And then the quote, of course, that they often come to is Jackson's reflection that the Constitution is not a suicide pact. And throughout the course of our class, we, especially from the Civil War onward, we talk about sort of enduring questions of war and civil liberties. And they find that that Jackson's insight goes well with that of Lincoln, with others from the World War II era cases, and sort of helps them figure out helps them think through for themselves where they would strike a balance between liberty and security. And of course, we do not come to any consensus on what that balance should be in our class, but they are certainly helped by having that vision with them.
So what's next for you? What's the project that captures your time? When you're not doing this, you're on sabbatical right now, are you?
I am, yes.
So you're out doing some book tours, World War I and that stuff, but what's really your focus now?
The last 4 years have been a great opportunity to, during the Centennial of the First World War, to get Americans to focus on this important moment in our history, and I think that it's generated all kinds of things that I've been able to get involved with, and I think has left a long-term legacy in terms of new books, new films, museum exhibits, and a lot of local historical societies and other institutions have recorded, digitized, preserved materials for the long term. So the last 4 years have been great. I'm also right now, though, just finishing a book on a different topic. It's a history of Filipinos in the U.S. Armed Forces. And this is a chapter of American history that we really don't know. That for nearly 100 years, Filipinos and Filipino Americans have served in great numbers in the U.S. Armed Forces. We maintained a force called the Philippine Scouts that was effectively a colonial army that makes the United States look a lot more like the empires of Europe than we might care to imagine. But it's also a way for us to think about citizenship and military service and what we owe to all of the people who serve in our armed forces, which is a category broader than just those who serve in uniform in it, those who work for it, those who are affected by it, those who live with it. 67,000 of the 75,000 men who were on the Bataan Death March in 1942 were Filipinos. And I think most Americans don't know that. But many of those men, in fact, actually waited until 2009 to receive equitable veterans benefits from the U.S. government at levels equivalent to U.S. Army soldiers. And so I think there's a very long history in that to be told for the first time to many Americans, and also for people from the Philippines for whom this is in fact actually a very well-known history, to see how it connects to the United States, and how the Philippines and the United States have remained close in the years since 1946, when it gained its independence.
I was going to say, during that time period, they were was they an American protectorate? What was the status?
So the Philippines was a territory of the United States effectively from the Treaty of Spain in 1898 until 1946, when independence came. It was always an unincorporated territory, so not on a path to statehood, but was effectively part of the United States for 48 years.
United States Supreme Court Justice Jackson swears in Vice President Sergio Osmeña as the new president of the Philippine Commonwealth. Congratulated by his daughter, Senor Osmeña signs his oath of office as successor to the late Manuel Quezon.
The history of the U.S. and the Philippines and the history of the U.S. Supreme Court are in fact actually much more interwoven than we might think. So one of the first things that has to be sorted out in a series of cases called the insular cases is the status of the new territories, not just the Philippines, but Puerto Rico, Guam, Hawaii, etc. And this becomes sort of a constitutional question. And then, of course, William Howard Taft gets his start as the Governor General of the Philippines. It is also another Governor General of the Philippines is Frank Murphy, who later takes a seat on the court, basically right after, soon after his time in the Philippines. And it also generates a series of other sort of Supreme Court cases around citizenship, around migration status, around the status of veterans and welfare benefits for World War II veterans, that really sort of persist even after independence in 1946. One that I get is about Woodrow Wilson's stroke. And I think that this actually raises important constitutional questions.
This is with his wife Edith, sort
yes.
of that petticoat government or whatever it was called.
Yes, and so as we know, Wilson suffers actually a series of strokes in 1919 and perhaps even some small ones before that effectively make it impossible for him to govern. And a small circle of advisors, particularly his chief, what we would now call Chief of Staff, Joseph Tumulty, and his wife Edith Wilson, close the circle around him and effectively take over the day-to-day tasks of governance. Now, there are two ways of interpreting this, right? One is to say that Edith Wilson was America's first woman president. She was effectively making decisions about policy, in part by controlling access to the president. She was handling his correspondence. She was making decisions that she thought Woodrow would do, essentially making her own decisions but calling them his. And many people would say, she really should have the credit for that. I am one of those who goes back to the text of the Constitution, which did not at that point have the amendments around like the 25th Amendment that we've heard so much about lately. It did not have clear provisions in place, but nevertheless there was a vice president, Thomas Marshall, not necessarily the greatest politician in American history. Known to us today only for his quote that what this country needs is a good 5-cent cigar. But nevertheless, that was the person who should have been leading our country at this time. And so I do think we can only see Edith Wilson as a constitutional usurper. And it's certainly not a trend that we would want to see repeated in any administration. That wherever I go to give a talk or be involved in some sort of event, that there are people who know enormous amounts, whether it's about one particular branch of the armed services, about a particular battle or campaign, about their community and its history during the war. And I think that the Centennial has given us a chance to see the importance of state and local history that I think is always competing for funds, for attention, but nevertheless is really sort of crucial to telling our bigger national history. Right? That we can't understand America in the world without understanding America, and we can't understand that without understanding sort of wherever it is that we're from.
The greatest generation, being the World War II folks, they're in their 90s and dying. The World War I can remember certainly meeting them, my grandfather, etc., but long gone. Is there a national interest in World War I?
I hope so, but I am afraid my biggest fear about the Centennial is that when we get to November 11th, 2018, and mark that 100 years since the end of the First World War, that it will disappear into the deep forgotten past of American history, back there with the War of 1812. And without personal connections, and with the fact that the images, the music, the culture from that period seems very distant to us, I think that is possible. But that would be a terrible mistake, right? Because the world we live in today continues to be shaped by it, both by the questions people asked at the time. How big should our army be? What should America's role be in the world? Should we go it alone? Should we have allies? How will we pay for our wars? How will we allocate rights and obligations? Those questions are enduring. And the decisions that we made continue to be with us a century later. So I hope, I fear that this may be the last sort of great moment of interest in the First World War, but I would love to be proved wrong about that.
Yeah. Well, you've been a sport. Thank you.
No, well, thank you.